Well, as Michael said, I've recently returned from Melbourne from Canberra, where I was for the past 3 years or so, and I sort of had the fortune, or the sometimes frustration, of working on the current clean carbon pricing mechanism from start to finish. And I guess it's significant because it's the first time in Australia that we've placed a price on an environmental externality nationwide through a market mechanism. And I think the heated politics has, I think, sometimes detracted from its significance in Australia at putting a price on carbon that will be filtered through to society at large, through consumers paying a price on the carbon intensity of activities. So I'll just focus quickly on 3 points. The first, I'll just quickly look at the design of the CPM and then reflect on the design and implementation, sort of reflect on what enabled the successful passage of the package through Parliament as opposed to its previous iterations. And thirdly, I'll look at sort of do a brief comparison between putting a price on carbon and sort of compare it to putting a price on biodiversity and some of the similarities and differences. Because I think it's, I was having a conversation at lunch, and I mean, it's important to remember that carbon now is part of the mainstream policy dialogue, but 20 to 30 years ago it certainly wasn't, and it was struck with the types of challenges that we're now talking about in relation to biodiversity. Having said that, there are clear differences between pricing carbon and biodiversity. And actually, just before I go to the mechanism, I mean, I think it's clear that there are a range of policy tools that you can use to address environmental challenges, and they range from command and control, which is typically sort of direct regulation, to sort of hybrids, and then the other end, market mechanisms. And I think while two things. I mean, I guess corporate responsibility has certainly come a long way in the past 10 years, and we're seeing corporations do some really innovative things just because they see that it makes a difference to the value of their business. However, I think that really to see the changes that we need to see, I think market mechanisms put in place through legislation and regulatory frameworks really are the only solution, certainly to addressing climate change, as well as probably biodiversity in the long run. Well, hopefully the shorter term, but probably biodiversity more in the long run. You all know the threats of climate change and that we need to sort of reduce emissions by at least 50% in all major economies by 2050. And I do think market mechanisms are the only way of getting us there. And just to build on what Pavan said, I mean, there's generally two approaches to implementing market mechanisms to address environmental challenges. The first is to change behaviour in a way that discourages production of a harmful substance. So that's the typical internalising the externality. And an example of this is the carbon pricing mechanism. A second type of market mechanism is to directly incentivise investments in positive environmental activities, and an example of that in Australia is probably the only example of that in Australia at the moment is the RET scheme, which sort of increases our share of renewable energy as opposed to reducing the intake of a harmful substance. So you're probably, all of you I'd say, are broadly familiar with the design of the CPM, but I'll run through the sort of the key elements. And really in any emissions trading scheme, the sort of 5 elements need to be addressed. So I'll run through those 5 elements and how they've been applied in Australia. So the first is, of course, the obvious one, you need a cap. And so this is a very beneficial element of a scheme because you can set the environmental outcome at the beginning. You know the target that you will achieve at the end through setting the cap in advance. And that's, of course, a key difference between a cap and trade and a tax, where you don't know what the environmental outcome will be. So in Australia, we've set up an independent climate change authority that will recommend the cap to the government and the government will set the cap by end of May 2014. Australia is quite, it's different from Europe in that it will set its cap through 5-year windows with the intention of giving business as much certainty as possible in terms of planning 5 years at a time. The coverage of our scheme has targeted purely the sort of high emitting industries, and that is sort of course, efficient from an economic point of view. I think in Australia, the top 50 liable entities cover or make up 75% of the pollution in the scheme. So that's a really, from an economist's point of view, that's a very efficient way of designing a mechanism. And the next step in an emissions trading scheme is, well, you set the cap, you've determined the coverage, then now how do you go about allocating an amount of units that will equal the cap? So this, I'll touch on this later, but this is, in any emissions trading scheme, the most contentious element probably, because in Australia there was quite a bit of free allocation to what's called ET companies, emissions intensive trade exposed. So some of the allocation will be given for free to those companies. The rest of it will be auctioned from 2015, and the government is currently going through the process of setting up the auction platform, and is sort of keenly watching how auctioning is going in other schemes such as California in terms of setting our design. The next element is the trading, which is probably just as important as the rest of them, in that it really enables units to be traded in the market so that the companies that place the highest value on them pay that price, and it provides an incentive for those the companies that can reduce their emissions to reduce it if they can do it at a cost below the carbon price. And the last element is compliance. I mean, what's the point of a scheme if there is no penalty for not complying? So in Australia, there's an emissions shortfall charge, which is higher than the cost of, which will be more than double of the cost of an emissions unit. So that obviously incentivises companies to comply. So this just, you've probably seen Treasury's predictions of the abatement challenge. I think to reach even the 5% target, we'll have to reduce emissions by around 160 million tonnes by 2020, and of course our 2050 target is sort of even more stringent at 80%. But I mean that's a good element of an emissions trading scheme, is that once you've got the infrastructure in place, it's very easy to to tweak the detail in terms of you can easily change the cap and achieve, sort of scale it up at a relatively low cost. So just now reflecting on some of the elements that enabled this the scheme to go through Parliament, I think the first one is, I mean, the Australian scheme, it does have its weaknesses, which I'll also touch on, but it has been recognised internationally as being quite a well-designed scheme. And I think an aspect of this is that we were able to build off a well-established regulatory framework in the areas of tax and property and financial services. So this is something that for biodiversity would be important, is to really leverage off the sort of well-established systems in Australia. I guess property for biodiversity would be particularly relevant. The second point with climate change is really now the states have accepted that the Commonwealth is best placed to lead on climate change. It's clearly a global issue. States have really stepped back and said, well, they will of course do complementary measures, but the Commonwealth was really able to take the lead. This is, of course, in contrast to management of rivers in Australia, which is still there's still a fierce battle going on between states and Commonwealth as to who is best placed to put in place effective measures. The next point was the MPCC process. I think it's sort of generally agreed that was a success. It was a good example of politicians from with different ideas coming together and actually reaching a successful outcome, and that I think enabled there to be a lot of buy-in from both politically but also including the business community. And I think that, again, private sector engagement, it was sort of a contrast with this iteration compared to, say, under Rudd's version, is that there was a conscious decision to involve the private sector at the various stages. I mean, I know I was sort of in the team working on the design of various elements of the CPM, such as the surrender charge, and that we really relied quite heavily on business to sort of provide their input into that, and similarly with auctioning and the use of units in the scheme. So there's been sort of a move towards recognising that the business sector is well placed to contribute. The next one is, I think DCCEE, the culture and composition. I think this is another sort of perhaps contrast between carbon and biodiversity. It was created as a department 2010. It's, a very young department, really created with a view that that there might be a market-based system to address climate change. And so the composition it has a strong mix of scientists, economists, lawyers and policymakers. And so that it really was this sort of melting pot. It was sort of more akin to a treasury type department than an environmental department. So I think that gave it a strong. It was very focused on a markets-based outcome from the beginning. And the last one is really global developments, is that despite what Abbott says, I mean, there is a trend at the moment globally to use emissions trading schemes as a tool to address climate change. So Australia could leverage off what was happening in Europe, certainly, and Korea, California, and a whole lot of other countries under the World Bank's Partnership of Market Readiness. The weakness is, of course, it's been alluded to earlier, the industry lobbying. Addressing environmental challenges does require, in most cases, a major sort of move away from doing things business as usual, and this does equal huge costs. And so industry lobbying, it was just intense during the development of the CPM. I think the ET's team met with hundreds of companies who all claim that they should be eligible for some free allowances, and so there is that trade-off of really sort of getting business buy-in, but also trying to maintain the environmental effectiveness of the scheme. And I think that is, as I said earlier, a good aspect of an ETS, because you can set it up and strengthen it quite easily over time. So just very quickly, comparing carbon with biodiversity. Carbon, I guess now it's easy. It's sort of, I guess it's compared to carbon isn't easy, but compared to biodiversity, it's relatively straightforward to put a price on carbon. Carbon is tangible. 1 tonne is a tonne. It doesn't matter if the tonne is produced by a steel factory and bought by an electricity generator. It's tangible. So 1 CO2 equals 1 CO2 somewhere else. Whereas, of course, biodiversity, there's a number of different ways to measure biodiversity. It depends on the location, the environmental conditions, combination of trees, combination of species. And so it's the question of whether you can create a standardised single currency with biodiversity is clearly the top issue, and that's what we're really discussing today. To create any any market mechanism, you need MRV and accounting frameworks. So really for carbon now, we've had MRV in place for the last few years through our NGAs system, and that's, again, even though there are 6 gases that contribute to pollution in our CPM, they can all be sort of valued and condensed and measured through one value, which is the CO2 equivalent value, whereas again, biodiversity, to do an MRV, you would have to do a sort of a really detailed mapping of Australia based on all the different types of habitats and ecosystems. And the key question is, well, again, with carbon, the accounting, and that's really what units you can use to measure or to use against a target. And so whether you could condense biodiversity into, say, 4 or 5 different values is, again, questionable. I think a key question is as well, I'll just finish off here. A key question is what sort of mechanism then could be applied to biodiversity. And these are basically the different options. I think the key thing is that they all need to be demand driven. So you do need to somehow incentivise positive investments in biodiversity rather than it being a pure offset mechanism in the long run. And also, what role can REDD Plus play and CFI? I mean, we've got these established frameworks, so should we be really focusing on building on them? And I guess you could do it in two ways: build in a biodiversity requirement into any REDD or CFI project, or you could have a target put on developers or mining companies that they could use REDD Plus or CFI credits as well in a sort of a different scheme, building off the carbon scheme. So I'll leave it there. That was a bit rushed, but